Recording. Okay, welcome to the second class of the second week of Com 1010. Yes, I know you're bored with it already because, yeah, this stuff can be a little dry. I admit it. The next unit, when we start with history and then law, it'll get a little bit more interesting. But this is straight from the book. This is stuff we're supposed to cover, and it does give you some background into what we're talking about. So we'll probably finish up most of it today, and then next, what day? Okay, next Monday, I will do another, we'll do a review of what we've done already. And then the second part of next week, we will have a test. It'll be online Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And so take time to take the test. And I will have Monday a review for the test. We will, and I'll post that. Okay, yeah, you don't like tests either. But it's one of those sort of things we have to do. So I'll have a review. We'll go over stuff in the test, and then we'll just go over this stuff. It'll be 100 points, 50 questions, multiple guess, and true and false. So that's what we'll do. Anyway, so all right, you go and chill. But yeah, we'll have, and so we're finishing up with all of this. The essays were good. I really appreciate it. So we will finish up. And here's, okay, where were we? Okay, we're talking about about the media and how it affects us. If you remember last time, before we even look at things like violence or any of that stuff, just the fact that we are using the media, as McLuhan said, that is the message. When we're on Zoom or we're texting, we're not actually talking with real people. We're not playing outside. We're glued to the screen. So that in itself is a message. So, the medium is the message, meaning the fact that we're there. It affects us from day one. Other effects, and we will get into this later in the class. How do we know how it affects us? Like I said, research, not rumor. We talk about violence. Does the media make us violent? When they actually tested that out, it's more complicated than we think. It is that, they show violent cartoons to a bunch of kids and then turn them loose with some, as we used to call them, Bobo dolls, blow up things that wobble around. Some kids wailed on them. Some kids just wanted to give them a hug. Different media affects us in different ways. So what they found out is the kids who were predisposed to violence acted violence. Those who were more gentle were not violent. So again, media violence depends. There's a lot of other things at work. Same thing with sex and social things. We will get to that. Okay, but it's research, not rumor, not just what you think. People who do real studies, surveys, experiments, not when you find when we look at things, it's a lot more complicated than you may think. A lot of people think that technology changes society. We call that technological determinism. Maybe, maybe not. Again, there's more, it's what we do with the technology. Okay. The economics of the media, like we said at the very beginning last week, media are mostly businesses. And if they're businesses, where does the money come from? Advertising. And we'll talk about advertising later in the course. You see it, YouTube, commercials, banners, all of that, ads in print. Those people pay for the media. The more eyeballs you have on a website or a video or a movie, the more you can charge for advertising. And that's what we call that the retail model. The more popular the item, the more you can charge, because more people want it. The prices go up, supply and demand. The retail model also tells us how we get, I'll type that in, content that we buy suppliers, producers. Most of the media we see aren't produced by the channel. They're not produced by ABC, CBS, Disney. They have independent producers making a movie. And then you have the wholesaler, which is often a studio or producer, and a retailer is the channel or site. So each step of the way, somebody is influencing the content. If you're making a movie, you decide, aha, I think we should make a Christian vampire fantasy movie. When people ask me about writing movies, it usually falls into those genres. So if you do all of them together, maybe you got a good movie. So you put your movie together. Once you have it, you have to raise the money and make it. Then you have to get a distribution deal with Disney or Sony, and then they sell it to the theater. If you're on TV, the producer sells it to the network, and the network sells it to or supplies it to the local station, and the local station pays a fee to put the TV show on the air. So every step of the way, someone's making a decision, just like buying at a store. So when we talk about media bias and ethics, every step of the way, somebody's making some decisions, and those decisions come down to money. The producer wants to sell to the wholesaler, wants to sell to Disney. Disney wants to make money, so they will get something that people will buy. The retailer who gives you the advertising, they want somebody who's going to watch and have the ratings go up. So that's why we have, and I will ask this on a test, so many comic book movies. Because we know people like the comic books. And everyone along the line know it will sell. I mean, Wonder Woman was a big one this year. Now, Disney owns Marvel. So if they own Marvel and they're the producer, they're the studio, they buy the producer, they own the studio, and then they own Disney Plus. They own all of it. And so they could really determine what we see. And if you own all of it, the bottom line is you want to reach as many people as possible. So if you're going to make something funky, experimental, different, they're not going to be interested. They're going to want, Disney's going to want to get the most massive audience, the most economically they can, which is why, again, they own Marvel and they own the Muppets. All of those things, one script, cha-ching, cha-ching, one script, comic book, swag, games. And so you could repurpose that one script 100 times over, and each time cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. And then you put it on your site. How does that affect the content? And this is true of news too. The bigger the audience and more attractive it is to the producers. There again. So when they talk about sex and violence, the reason is violent TV gets higher ratings. It's simpler as that. If you don't like sex and violence, turn it off. That, folks, is the reality. Okay. Retail modern issues, especially on the internet. The internet was free originally. And so how does one make the economics? This has been a problem with what we call mainstream media, with newspapers and TV stations. Why watch a TV station with commercials when you can get the content free? Why read a magazine or newspaper when you can get free stuff that you could read without it? So a lot of traditional media got in trouble. Newspapers, where I come from, a lot of them went out of business because they don't know how to make money when there's so much free content. And so much of the free content is poor quality, or people lie, but it's free. So it's complicated. Decoupling means that the advertisers don't need to go to the TV station anymore. They could send you emails directly. They don't have to advertise. They'll send you an email. They put up their own ads. They don't need to buy advertising time. So things have changed. And a lot of media doesn't know how to handle that. And that's causing the great media culling, as this article says. So many of the media outlets, mostly print, newspapers, magazines, but TV stations, they can't operate. Radio stations. Disney is starting streaming services, Disney Plus and Amazon Prime. With the decoupling of advertising, they're selling streaming services instead. So they make their money by selling, going back to the retail model. Console direct as in they can sell, straight to you, and you can see The Mandalorian, and they don't need a TV station, but they can. You know who Disney owns? ABC. They own CBS. No, Sony owns CBS. But no, Disney owns ABC. It owns ESPN. So they could put a sporting event on ESPN, ABC, and Disney. Cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. Other competing media, again, the internet, where things are free. Disney is an example of conglomeration, that you have one or two big companies, Sony, which owns CBS, Time Warner, which owns HBO. You have a couple of big companies that control everything. And how does that affect content? Like I said, comic book movies. You get lots of stuff that may not be all that good, but you're going to watch it because you like it. Again, Mandalorian is good, but you'll watch just about anything. Come on, move.
There were limits to where I could go with an associate's degree. So I decided I would.
Hey, check it out. I just got this new phone. Well, kind of. I'm renting it for a couple of bucks a month, but really that's part of a bundle. I got my cell phone, my internet, my cable, all one bill, which is pretty convenient. The phone is made by another company, of course, but they have this exclusive deal with the bundle people, and the bundle people have a deal with the streaming service people. So now I can stream movies all the time, and the streaming service I use has a deal with my favorite TV channel so I can watch all my shows. And the TV people just bought my favorite comic book franchise, so soon I'll be swimming in new superhero movies. And the comic book people will be raking in the cash. Kind of complicated, no? So many deals and bundles and acquisitions to watch for. It makes you wonder who runs all this stuff. Who owns the media? Sure, maybe you've been keeping track of who owns your favorite media franchises like Star Wars, that's Disney, or Marvel, also Disney, or Harry Potter, Warner Brothers, but also NBC. That way you can judge who's going to do a great job with your favorite storylines or totally ruin them with the worst casting ever. Oh my God, why? The media at large, everything from newspapers you read to the apps on your phone, are part of a big web of deals and partnerships and mergers, a very tangled kind of incestuous web. Sometimes these complex relationships work out well for the consumer, but sometimes this tangled web traps the consumer like a juicy little fly just waiting to be eaten by the big bad spider. That's why today we're talking all about media ownership. We're going to figure out how ownership impacts your everyday lives, and we're going to talk about the history of media ownership. And no, that's it for today, but that's plenty. Ready for your head to spin a bit? So who really owns the media? If you look at things from the end of 2017, the media ownership landscape looks like this. Walt Disney Company owns ABC and the Disney Channel, of course, plus ESPN, Miramax, and Pixar, Marvel Entertainment and Publishing, Buena Vista Records, and over 270 radio stations, plus their theme parks and tons of other related companies. Comcast Corporation owns NBC Universal. That means CNBC, MSNBC too, plus channels like Telemundo, USA Network, Bravo, and more, plus Hulu and the Universal Studios theme parks. They even own the Philadelphia 76ers and the Philadelphia Flyers. News Corp owns Fox, including Fox News and FX. They also own the Wall Street Journal, the Daily News, and the New York Post, HarperCollins, and 20th Century Fox. Hearst Corporation owns 20 U.S. magazines like Cosmopolitan and Esquire, plus 31 television stations. Viacom owns MTV, VH1, Nickelodeon, Comedy Central, and BET, among its 160 cable channels, plus Paramount Pictures. CBS Corporation owns all the CBS named things, 29 TV channels, and 130 radio stations, plus 3 book publishers. And this is all just the tip of the iceberg. I guarantee that this ownership web is already obsolete as new deals have gone through. In fact, as we were shooting this episode, Comcast, Disney, and Fox had all been discussing a possible merger. But don't worry, we prepared for that. There was a big merger. There wasn't a big merger. There was something like a merger, but it was more complicated than we predicted.
Yes, so that's what happened. Fox sold its news operation to Disney, but it kept it kept other things separate.
But all this talk of mergers and ownership begs the question, who cares? You do, or rather you will, after you hear the story of AT&T. The year is 1877, and Alexander Graham Bell and his father-in-law start the Bell Telephone Company. Over time, Bell becomes the dominant telephone provider and is the first to build a nationwide long-distance telephone network. That's when they're renamed the American Telephone and Telegraph Company. For almost 100 years, AT&T owns every part of the telephone system.
Yes, Alexander Graham Bell didn't really invent the telephone. Lots of other people worked on it. He put the package together. But what Bell did invent was the phone company.
From the wires and lines to the actual phones. Yes, literally. Until the mid-1980s, if you had an AT&T phone, you had to rent it from the company, kind of like you rent a modem for your internet now. In the early 1900s, AT&T established themselves as a walled garden. That meant it was a closed system that was not interoperable with other systems or companies. In fact, they refused to let rival companies work with them. They just buy them out instead. In 1915, for instance, they bought Western Electric, one of the providers of their phone equipment. Once they owned them, they made it so that only official Western Electric equipment could connect to the AT&T network. Jump ahead to 1934. President Franklin D. Roosevelt establishes the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC is meant to implement a national radio and wire service in the U.S., but the FCC also has the authority to examine AT&T's business. The question was whether AT&T's control over every part of the phone system, or vertical integration, was in violation of the law. But the FCC approves of AT&T's business, and the company is free to dominate the market for decades, becoming bigger and bigger. Eventually, though, AT&T becomes too big, like way too big, and the antitrust lawsuits start. Antitrust laws are what exist to try and prevent monopolies, when a single company dominates an entire market or industry. Monopolies are bad in a lot of ways. A company with a monopoly can overcharge customers or underdeliver services because there's simply no competition. Preventing monopolies, or if you have to, breaking them up, protects consumers and encourages competition. And by the 1980s, more than a century after the founding of the Bell Company, those anti-monopoly efforts finally start to make a difference. In 1982, AT&T starts letting people buy their own phones, a good first step. But in 1984, the monopoly really breaks up and the company separates into 7 different smaller companies. At the time, some people thought the breakup of the AT&T monopoly was bad. It seemed so convenient to get all your phone maintenance in one place. When it did break up, though, we got cool new inventions like answering machines, 3-way calling, and caller ID, all thanks to an outbreak of competition. Trust me, those things were really cool back then. Today, companies try to dominate markets through new versions of vertical integration. Think, do you have one of those bundles? You might get your TV service, internet, and cell phone service from the same company. These companies own the world's fiber optic cables where the internet flows. In fact, where the last 100 years of antitrust media has largely been about phones, these days it has way more to do with the internet. But that's where it gets a bit dicey. Let's head into the thought bubble. In a world with net neutrality, a corporate stronghold on the internet isn't too bad. You pay for internet access and you use it pretty much however you want. The net is neutrally accessible from different internet service providers or ISPs. If your ISP stinks or is too slow, you can often pay for a different service if there are options in your area. But the ISPs believe that since they're delivering you a service, they should determine how it's delivered. They'd like to create tiered services where if you pay more, you get faster internet. Basically, they want to use their vertical integration to create more monopolies. Imagine the internet is a road and the content you want is a car. ISPs would like to create a slow lane and a fast lane, or maybe a slow, medium, and fast lane. Depending on what you want or can afford, you'd pay for that speed.
Yep, that's net neutrality. We'll get to that.
ISPs could decide to create a slow lane and a fast lane, you can see how they could abuse that power pretty quickly. We wouldn't get a fast lane and a faster lane. We'd get a so slow you want to smash your computer on the ground lane and a probably the speeds you have now but twice as expensive lane. As we know, internet access is crucial to thriving in the digital age, and hiking up prices would box some people out entirely. Or to put it more graphically, some people would be in the lifeboats and some people would be Jack and Rose floating on a door in the middle of the ocean until Jack freezes to death, even though he totally could have fit on the door. Thanks, Thought Bubble, I guess. There are more consequences to net neutrality than consumer pricing. Without net neutrality, ISPs have the power to cut off or speed up certain content, like say their business partners or their sister companies. Certain cars wouldn't even be allowed in the slow lane. You'd have to pay extra. So if you have Comcast as your ISP, your Comcast, NBC, and Universal content might be faster, but other content might be slow. Comcast owns Hulu and Netflix is a competitor of Hulu, so who knows? Maybe they'd slow down your service to Netflix. The horror. In some countries without net neutrality, ISPs have already created walled gardens like this. You pay a...
Yeah, and that's starting to happen. Disney Plus, Peacock, not everybody is able to see all the same stuff all the time. You get to just see what the big company wants you to see.
Base fee for internet service and then pay additional fees for a social media package to access your apps or a news package to get your news. It's not pretty. You can see why it's so important to understand how media companies are all connected. When they come together to form monopolies, they can have a huge impact on how a society communicates. We know that media companies like to band together through mergers and acquisitions. Sometimes this forms healthy competition, and sometimes, like we said, it creates a monopoly. But telecommunications and media have been regulated and studied for some time. You know what also like to band together through mergers and acquisitions, sometimes for competition and sometimes to form monopolies? Tech companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon. These monster corporations have their hands on a ton of different projects. Alphabet is Google's parent company. Google isn't just a search engine, it's also an advertising platform. Alphabet owns YouTube and over 200 other companies. Plus, they make products like Android phones and Gmail and self-driving cars. And through search and Google News, they've become a major distributor of media. Amazon, in addition to being a dominant e-commerce platform, provides the internet infrastructure for tons of top companies. It also creates its own TV and movie programming through Prime and owns the Washington Post. Similarly, Facebook owns over 50 companies like Instagram and WhatsApp. It recently partnered with news outlets to help with media distribution through its journalism project and its instant articles product. They're even dipping their toes into creating original video programming. Plus, 45% of US adults get their news from Facebook. 45%.
And that's 2 years ago. It's more now. So yeah, I mean, and where do you get your news? From your friends, not somebody who checks the facts. Welcome to the new world, y'all.
And yet they don't call themselves a media company. What's the big deal? Well, currently, tech companies aren't regulated the same way that media companies are. Remember the FCC? They regulate media companies not only to break up monopolies, they also set rules for what kind of content is allowed on TV, radio, and phones. Different rules for different technologies. This is why some songs have radio edits and why you have to bleep out the live TV when the Thanksgiving parade hosts get too tipsy. But the FCC doesn't currently have the same authority over companies like Facebook or Google, which means there is tons and tons of debate over whether they should. Media ownership can be problematic enough. When one company dominates the means of production and creation on one product, consumers often get a lesser product. Without competition, innovation stagnates. And when companies have too much control, they can wreak havoc on our communication and culture. When tech companies that are also media companies don't act like it, they shirk the accountability.
And we have certainly seen that. But on the other hand, if you take down things you disagree with, are you limiting free speech? This is obviously a big political thing. The Facebook and Twitter took down Parler, the right-wing site, and President Trump. Now, they can, it's not the FCC and the government limiting them, but if you're getting your news through Facebook and Trump isn't there anymore, are you losing contact with your president? Is that a limitation of free speech? Again, I'm not going to answer that because there is no answer. It is a valid question. Legally, yeah, you can, obviously. Should it be? That's an ethical question.
That other media organizations have, the accountability that we as consumers rely on. Antitrust regulations have their drawbacks. People who prefer less government intervention don't like them. The monopoly man certainly doesn't like them, but they're often in the public's best interest to prevent exploitation and encourage creativity. To be a media literate citizen is crucial to keep an eye on how these businesses combine, split up, and interact. Their relationships with each other affect our relationships with media. Today, we covered how huge corporations and their regulations impact our media environment, the macro stuff. Next time on Crash Course Media Literacy, we're going micro. We'll take a look at how government policies impact how you, the consumer, absorb and create media. Until then, I'm Jay Smooth. See you next time.
Crash Course Media Literacy is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney studio in Missoula, Montana. It's made with the help of all of these nice people, and our animation team is Thought Cafe.
Anyway, there's a lot there. But the bottom line is big corporations control your access. And whether they're, Disney and HBO and NBC or Facebook and Google or Amazon, there's a lot.
Welcome to this SY2 screencast, looking at issues connected to the ownership and control of the mass media. And this is the first of 2 screencasts on this particular topic.
Just a little bit.
And in this short video, we're going to look at changing patterns in the ownership of the mass media, focused.
Not nearly as fun as the other guy.
Now, when it comes to categorizing different forms of media ownership, there are 2 main types of media.
Yeah. The government controls the BBC in the UK. In the US, it's private. They're private companies. So the government, the problem is with BBC, they can't say bad things about the Queen. So there's a lot more censorship.
As its primary aim.
Okay, let's go to the next thing.
Big increases in things like TV choice. However, critics such as McChesney argue that this choice and diversity is in reality quite superficial, that we have the appearance of choice, but in reality, we have the control of the media market by a few large organizations.
There you go.
To describe a situation where a few companies own most of the mainstream media. For example, if we look at this particular graph, this is looking at media stations, TV stations within America are owned by only 6 corporations.
There they are.
And many commentators are concerned that the control of the market by a few large companies might potentially have a detrimental effect.
There you go.
Production. For example, if we take the film industry, you can get a media company which can own the Hollywood studio, the distribution companies, as well as the cinema showing the film.
And that's why we see so many comic book movies.
This is where a media organization develops by buying up competitors in the same section of the market. So a contemporary example of this would be an internet company such as Google purchasing an internet company such as YouTube. So what is the motive for media concentration? Well, from the perspective of media owners, media concentration is only worthwhile if it can increase profits. So, for example, some media companies look for diversification. In other words, they look to operate in as many different media industries as possible in order to spread risk, in order to make sure.
Also to control content. Like I said, one script could be a TV show, could be a comic book, could be a game.
That all of their eggs use different versions of the same product.
Like I was saying.
So, for example, a book.
That's called synergy.
Each with distinct identities operating in different sectors of the market. And they're most often formed through a process of mergers and acquisitions. Now, currently, the biggest media conglomerate in the world is the Walt Disney Company. And as you can see from this image, there are many. Fox News Corporation. So you might recognize this image of Rupert Murdoch. News Corporation has many different interests.
Last year, they sold off the news and business part. Sky TV, that's in Britain. We can go through them.
Raise questions about News Corporation's negative impact on democracy.
Yeah.
So though Fox News uses the slogan fair and balanced, most commentators would argue that Fox News is not balanced. It's very partisan and is very heavily biased towards the main right-wing party within America, the Republicans. Because so many of Rupert Murdoch's news organizations reflect this kind of right-wing bias, this raises some interesting questions about what happens when one or two media conglomerates dominate within a single market. And the important questions this raises include whether or not these media organizations will present a diversity of opinions, whether or not big media organizations can exercise undue political influence. And there are lots of accusations about the influence that Murdoch has had on British party politics. And thirdly, whether or not big media organizations will be willing to present information within the news that may be damaging to either their advertisers or to themselves. Now, despite the emphasis on media concentration within the sociological literature, there are several factors that suggest that the steady march of the media conglomerates towards complete domination of global markets may not be inevitable. For example, the failure to make very large corporations work effectively for the benefit of their shareholders has led to the decision to demerge certain media companies in recent years. For example, AOL, the internet provider, and Time Warner have now gone their separate ways. And going back to our case study, News Corporation, because of the controversies surrounding the phone hacking scandal, there are plans to break up News Corporation,
which they didn't do,
of startup companies engaged in computing and online activity. However, it could be argued that these corporations are trying to dominate.
And this is another thing. Mining our personal information. When I look at a website, if I look at an ad to buy shoes, I am swamped with shoe ads or car ads. So, why is that happening? Because Google and Facebook sell your information to their advertisers, so they know what you're doing.
Computer and internet-based media activities in much the same way that the older media conglomerates have tried to do so in the traditional media industries. Finally, the two most populous countries in the world, China and India, have a rapidly growing middle class, providing a home market.
China has state-controlled media. You don't know what the Chinese people don't know what the Chinese are doing. For all we know, we don't know how much COVID they have. They're not telling us. India, it's wide open. Everybody says different things, and there's no control, so you don't know who to trust.
Market large enough to sustain large-scale media companies. And therefore, if we look at the future, it's likely to comprise a range of global media.
Yep, all sorts of different things going out here. But in the Western cultures, it's the conglomeration. Within that spectrum, a good entrepreneur can use different media in different ways. You can still come up with a different app and put that on yourself, sell it to Apple. Oops, another conglomerate, or post it on there. So there are ways you could do. Other models, nonprofits, there are some that are looking at that. Government sponsorship, which also leads to government censorship. They talked about net neutrality, and one of the things, net neutrality is something, when the internet started, when we first started in 1993, the government said everybody had to have equal access. The Trump administration lifted that, and thus you have Disney Plus and Amazon Prime, and you could have channels, like the guy said, that move faster in some areas and slower than others, and you have to pay for better internet access and for your entertainment. So you're paying more all the time. But on the other hand, in a free society, should a company be penalized or limited from making money? Again, that's a question for us all to answer. And that leads us to, and I covered most of the stuff in that one, leads us to a digital divide. The digital divide is, and we are seeing that a lot with school. Not everybody has access to good internet. I have EPB coming out of my house. EPB is great. It's cheap and it's fast, and it's a gig network, and we have free internet in downtown Chattanooga. Chattanooga is a great internet town, but not everybody lives in Chattanooga. Sometimes you have phone services. Sometimes, some students have to go to the library to get their internet. Some rural areas are still on dial-up. They're not going to have the access to the information or the education that you do. Even me, with a good internet connection, my laptop, since I'm doing a lot with video, filled up. My laptop memory is just totally full. My laptop is crap, can't move. I have a school computer here, which has a big memory, but it costs twice as much as my laptop. We're all on the digital divide. And the more money, the more access more money you have, more access you have. And a lot of people don't have the technology at home to handle all the videos. So sometimes Zoom crashes. So the people who have access to technology have access to education and to make money. So you notice the media world is complicated. And it's not so much about liberal or conservative. That that British one I showed you talked about conservative media. Certainly CNN is very anti-Trump. I would call them somewhat liberal. New York Times, but they're not everybody. So who's really running the media are the big companies, but you have some power. You don't have to watch things that you don't want. Ultimately, the audience has a great deal of influence. So think about that as you choose your own media consumption. Welcome to the real media world. It's not so black and white. So that pretty much covers the beginning of the course and the environment we're working with. I will have a review for it next week. Next Monday, I'll review for a test. Wednesday through Friday, I will have a test. And that's, and then we'll move on to the history of media and how it got there. Any questions from you folk? That's fine. I will post this shortly, and then I will go on and then we'll do more stuff, and we'll have a short one question extra credit thing that I'll do by tomorrow. And that's how we do it. Anyway, I will talk at you next week, and I'll post this shortly. Thank you for showing up. I will have the review session live at 11 a.m. Monday. But if anybody, I'm willing to consider other times. Anyway, I appreciate it. I will see you next time, and so will Juniper.